Okay, so welcome to this CACDAS webinar. This is actually our 32nd webinar. We started this series a couple of years ago, and these webinars are organised by the CACDAS Networking Project, which is based in the Department of Sociology at the University of Surrey, which is where I work. My name is Christina Silver, and I'm joined here by my colleague who also works with me at the university, Sarah Bullock.
Hello, everyone.
And we are really delighted to welcome you here to the first webinar of this academic year, which will be given by Dr. Catherine Miller, who's here as well. And I'll introduce Catherine to you shortly. We're also really pleased to have Alex Limpeacher here as well, who's the developer of Delve. So if you have any specific questions about Delve, then he'll be able to speak to those later on. Before we get going with the webinar, I just want to let you know that the next webinar that we've got scheduled is actually a session that I'll be leading about thematic analysis using digital tools, CACDAS packages, and that's coming up on the 4th of October. We do have a few others up our sleeves already. They just haven't been fully arranged, so they're not quite ready to advertise, but do keep looking on our social media and website for details of the others coming up in the next few months. We're also really delighted to let you know that we've got a few new workshops coming up. The two on the left-hand side there are new shorter format workshops coming up. So one on using digital tools for qualitative text analysis and another one using digital tools for visual analysis. And they are happening alongside our standard well-established, long-standing training courses on specific CACDAS packages that Sarah runs the majority of those, and there's a few forthcoming ones listed up there. But you can see all of our forthcoming events on our website, and Sarah is sharing in the chat some links if you want to tap into those. So that's just a little bit about what's coming up in the future. But really, we're here today to focus on our webinar using Delve for a case study from transcripts, analysing what teachers know. And I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you to Dr. Catherine Miller today, who recently received her PhD in teaching, learning and teacher education from the University of Pennsylvania. And today we'll share with us some of the analysis deriving from her studies, which involved using the qualitative app Delve, which she'll be showing us today. Kate has a varied and extensive experience in the education field, having started her career as a high school physics teacher, and she's worked as a science educator in not only formal settings, but also informal classrooms. Her current research focuses on supporting in-service science teachers to integrate math and technology into science classrooms, and she does that through focusing on digital and data literacy. To that end, Kate employs mixed methods research techniques on data sources ranging from multiple choice content knowledge surveys to focus groups and interviews. Her dissertation research explored pedagogical content knowledge for data literacy in a workshop series with experienced teachers, but I'm going to let Kate tell you all about that. Whilst Kate is speaking, please feel free to post any comments or questions that you have in the chat function of our Zoom meeting today, and we'll collate those as Kate is speaking, and then Sarah will facilitate a discussion later on. So we're really excited to hear about your research, Kate, and I know that everyone in the audience is keen to see how you've used Delve. So without further ado, I'd like to thank you very much for being here with us today and pass the floor over to you.
Excellent. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for that introduction, Christina. So as Christina mentioned, today I'm going to talk about a computer-assisted qualitative data analysis tool called Delve, but I'm going to present it within the context of educational research that I've been conducting for the last few years with high school science teachers around the use of data in high school science classrooms and the way in which data literacy is and can be developed with students and teachers. But before I get started, I know as you guys were coming in, you were sharing, some of you shared where you're joining us from, but I'd love to see in the chat where you're joining us from if you haven't shared that yet, and also your area of research, just to give me a little bit of information about who's on the call. And as that's coming in, oops, I can get us started. All right, Oscar joining us from London, thank you. Ooh, supply chains. It's definitely been an interesting area of research recently, I'm sure. All right, great. So as you all are sharing that, I'm gonna get started just talking a bit about my framing around this research. So for the last few years, one of the primary focuses of my research has been on data literacy. So data literacy is a compelling topic of study for a number of reasons. For one, as our world becomes increasingly awash in data, data literacy is a vital skill that is needed not only to pursue work in STEM fields, but also to basically to survive in the world. So, you know, we are surrounded by data with many of the decisions we make and decisions made for us about our health, our shopping habits, and the news we consume. Sort of everything is permeated by data. And increasingly in STEM fields, and especially STEM integrated fields, require the ability to work with, understand, and interpret real-world data sets. These real-world data sets are getting bigger, more complex, with more variables to study. And so as a result of these changes, data literacy is an increasingly vital skill to have, especially if you want to, you know, enact change in the world, engage with any type of science or STEM material, whether as your career or just as a citizen existing in the world. So what exactly do I mean by data literacy? So as data literacy is an emerging field, it's still defined in many different ways by those who study it. Within the STEM education fields, data literacy is the knowledge and skills needed to interact with data. So in education research and in the education fields with teachers and students, we really focus on what is it that students need to know and to be able to do in order to interact with the massive world of data that exists around them. So some common themes among the definitions of data literacy are that it's built on authentic data or data from real world scenarios that hasn't been manipulated or cleaned to make it easier to work with, and that data literacy requires being able to use that data rather than simply analyze it. So in traditional, especially science classrooms, there is sort of a history of working with data, but working with data that is cleaned or that is, already proving something that has already been proven. There hasn't been a lot, and this is changing, as we're sort of expanding to increase data literacy in high school classrooms. But there hasn't been a lot of work done on really complex real world data sets. Like, what does the data that's out in the world around you look like? How do you work with it? How do you use it? So data literacy requires knowledge from mathematics, specifically from statistics, from technology, such as statistical analysis tools and data collection tools. And then it also involves knowledge from the authentic context of science. So it really is a integrated STEM idea and concept because it brings in all these different pieces from across the STEM fields. So researchers from the fields of science and statistics education have begun to build a framework for some of the critical aspects of data literacy, which can serve as big ideas and objectives for educators designing learning progressions for the development of data literacy. However, while the study of these components and their development is becoming more prevalent in classrooms of all levels, nearly all research into data literacy at the K-12 level of education has been focused on students and their learning, while very little research has probed teachers' knowledge for data literacy and the pedagogical choices that are made when attempting to develop data literacy in K-12 classrooms. So I have spent a number of years now working with science teachers across a number of different projects that involved collecting and analyzing large, complex data sets in their classrooms. And I noticed that high school teachers who often have a high level of data literacy themselves still struggle with teaching it to their students. And so these are just some quotes from teachers that I've worked with over the years, from their interviews that we did with them post implementation of this data literacy in their classrooms, that show that they are still struggling with how to teach data literacy to their students. And we, through this work with these teachers, really developed this idea that there was a disconnect between teachers' knowledge of data literacy and their ability to actually teach the concepts of data literacy to their students. So I decided to probe teachers' knowledge of data literacy and how to teach it for my dissertation. So for this session, I will discuss the research I conducted for my dissertation with a specific focus on the methods and the Cactus tool that I used for my data analysis before briefly sharing some of my findings. So first, I'm going to give you a bit more context for what this research project was and sort of what it was grounded in. I know I'm seeing as they were coming in that not many of you are from the education field. So these big fancy terms, pedagogical content knowledge, might be foreign to many of you. But in the field of education research, especially education research on teacher knowledge and learning, this jargony term, pedagogical content knowledge, is a very common one. And in concept, it's actually relatively simple. It is the knowledge that combines pedagogical knowledge, or how to teach, with content knowledge, or what to teach. So it really is, as is shown in this quote here, right? This amalgam of content and pedagogy that is really uniquely the professional knowledge of teachers, right? Like an expert in a field has the content knowledge, and a teacher learns pedagogical skills. A teacher in sort of any classroom learns these universal pedagogical skills, but it is really how you apply those pedagogical skills to the particular content that is the profession of teaching, right? It is knowing your content and knowing the right pedagogical tools to use to teach that content. So in the case of my dissertation research project, the content knowledge being drawn on was data literacy. And I sought to understand how teachers thought about teaching data literacy, and if it involved different or unique pedagogical strategies than those they used to teach science, mathematics, or technology on its own. So based on this background and the need for a deeper understanding of what teachers know about teaching data literacy and additional research on how to support them in doing so, my research questions for my dissertation focused on what PCK, pedagogical content knowledge, for data literacy is, what PCK for data literacy teachers might already have, how that knowledge manifested and changed over the course of a PD intervention, professional development intervention, and how the different components of that professional development affected the outcomes. So a little bit of context for the dissertation itself. My dissertation study drew from a larger study that we've been working on for a number of years on designing and implementing professional development for a STEM integrated problem-based learning unit on bioinformatics. So again, a lot of sort of education jargon there, but STEM integrated, right? So bringing in science, technology, engineering, and math into a single project. Problem-based learning means that the unit was founded on a problem And for this project, the student-facing problem-based learning unit was focused on asthma and air quality. So the students used mobile air quality sensors, as shown here in this picture, to collect data on particulate matter and carbon monoxide levels in their schools and surrounding neighborhood. So they used this technology, these mobile sensors. They got to walk around their school, around their neighborhood. Some of the teachers allowed the students to take the sensors home and collect data in their home neighborhoods. And these tools were designed through an app to automatically put all of that data into a Google Sheet. So the students had this enormous Google Sheet full of data points. Some of the classes collected hundreds or even thousands of data points. The sensors were a little bit finicky, so the readings were not always accurate. Sometimes they read straight zeros. So this data collection resulted in a really messy, complex data set that needed to be cleaned and analyzed, to have inferences drawn, results communicated about how the air quality in their neighborhoods and school might be affecting asthma rates in their neighborhoods, their own experience with asthma. And so sort of making those connections. But because this data set was really big and messy and was real world data, it required a rather high level of data literacy in order for the students to interact with it and actually draw inferences and communicate results that could then lead them to think about, potential solutions for improving the air quality in their schools and neighborhoods. So in order to prepare teachers for teaching this unit with their students, we ran a professional development program for them. So there was an intensive 4-week summer professional development, which was conducted online. It was conducted primarily asynchronously on the edX platform. And through those activities that they conducted asynchronously, they then discussed in the course discussion forums, and we sort of supported the teachers in developing the knowledge and skills they would need in bioinformatics content, in mobile learning pedagogy, and data literacy. And that course included some sort of core features aimed at developing data literacy. They engaged with data in the full cycle of inquiry, right? They went through the whole unit as if they were students. They used the discussion forums to reflect on their teaching practice and, on sort of how they would engage students with the data literacy. However, as I showed with the earlier quotes, we found that teachers still struggled with implementing particularly the data literacy components of this unit with their students. So in order to attempt to address that disconnect between the knowledge and implementation, I worked with a small group of 4 teachers during the school year that they were implementing to conduct an additional PD workshop focused on that pedagogical content knowledge piece. And it engaged teachers in discussions of their implementation of the data literacy components, and really focused on sort of teasing out those pedagogy pieces, right? How are we teaching data literacy to students in the classroom? What are the tools that are particularly useful when trying to teach data literacy in a classroom? So a little bit about my data collection and sort of what I had for data, and then I'll talk about the data analysis method and how I used the Cactus Delve tool in order to do that. So data sources. This was really a qualitative project. So we had done, a lot of quantitative analysis on student results and other things like that on this project previously. But for my dissertation research, I was focused on qualitative data sources. So I ran these 9 virtual workshop sessions over the course of the year that the teachers were implementing. And those all happened virtually on Zoom. And were approximately a total of 15 and a half hours worth of Zoom recordings of these conversations that teachers were having in these workshops. And then I also conducted interviews with the teachers post-workshop. And there were 4 teachers, and that totaled to about 3.5 hours of audio recordings. And then there were surveys that the teachers did pre the summer PD, post-summer PD, and then post-workshop that had open response questions. So I had those written responses to those open questions from the survey. And then throughout the workshop, the teachers wrote written journal reflections. So I had these almost 20 hours worth of transcripts from the workshops and the interviews. And then I had these written responses for the teachers. And I don't know how you guys all do transcripts, but I will make a plug for the fact that Zoom's automatic transcript has actually gotten pretty good now. So I primarily use that actually in creating my transcripts from the virtual sessions. So from all of those data sources, I took a sort of qualitative case study approach to investigate the research questions. In a multiple case study approach, each case is first examined for in-case themes, and then the cases are compared to drive cross-cutting themes and wider, more generalizable implications. So, I looked at the interviews and the written responses and the transcripts of the sessions for each teacher to sort of build a case of that teacher's experience in the workshop. And then I compared all of those cases to pull out cross-cutting themes, for the more generalized learning that happened during the PD workshop. So in order to do all of that coding and pull out all of those themes, I used what's called the constant comparative method of qualitative analysis. This was developed actually back in the 1960s by Glaser, but the most cited reference to it is an article that was written in 2008. But for those of you that aren't familiar, the constant comparative method is a hybrid method of coding, which allows you to sort of cycle between deductive and inductive analysis of data because you are conducting the coding and analysis simultaneously. So it is more systematic than sort of just like a general theory development where you're just looking at your results and pulling out theories. But it also allows you to generate and suggest hypotheses in this sort of more systematic way. So you build a coding scheme basically as you go. So it can be quantized at the end if you want to do that. But it allows for development of theories as you go, but in a much more systematic way. So specifically, how I used Delve to do all of that. So Delve tool. Delve is a qualitative analysis tool that is web-based, and it can be used in groups. I did not use it that way. I was just doing this on my own, but I am going to show you sort of basically how I went through this process in Delve. And specifically, sort of why I found Delve to be particularly useful for the constant comparative method is that, as I will demo, it's really easy to add and reorganize codes as you're coding, which was really important for me as I was doing this iterative process of building the codes as I was going through the transcripts and then going back and rereading through the transcripts and applying the codes and combining them and moving them around. So I'm going to do a demo now that sort of walks through some of these sort of tools within Delve and really show you the process that I went through in coding my dissertation data. So Delve demo, yay. All right, so delvetool.com, and I'm gonna we're gonna log in. Okay. So here is my login to Delve. This is my list of all of my projects. This is my dissertation project. So as you can see here, I have all of my workshop transcripts over here on the left. I was able to upload them all in here. And then I have the written reflections and I have the interviews, all as sort of separate transcripts listed over here on the left. Each one that I open up opens up in the center so that I can go through and code it. And then over here on the right are all of my codes from my dissertation. So this was a dissertation project. So it was a real undertaking. And here we can list everything by codes and we can list everything by snippets. So in order to do a little demo here, what I'm actually going to do is create a new project. One of the things that I love too about Delve is you can copy the codes from an existing project into a new project. So I actually already did that, codes copied. So here I have a blank project, but it already includes all of my codes from my dissertation project. So they are all in here already. And I'm going to just do a demo. I have a demo transcript that I'm going to add in here. And there is my transcript. I literally was able to just drag and drop it in here. And here are all of my codes from my dissertation. So the process that I went through for doing this coding is that for each of the transcripts, basically I started with some big overarching categories, right? So that's the sort of deductive beginning of this process. So right off the bat, before I even started coding my transcripts, I added some big overarching categories from the research literature on pedagogical content knowledge and from data literacy. So for example, I added like knowledge of students' understanding of data, because that is a sort of big component of pedagogical content knowledge, right? Knowledge of students' understanding of data. And I added some of the components of data literacy, data and context from the literature in terms of what we were looking for around teachers' understanding of data literacy. Video reflections, right? That was one of the things that I did as part of the PD, and I wanted to know what teachers were thinking about that because that was one of my research questions. So I added some of these big overarching categories right off the bat to begin with. And then as I was going through the transcripts, I started coding them. You can just single click to select a sentence, and then you can add the code here. You can also search up here at the top to add the codes. You can add multiple codes to the same sentence. And so as I was going through this process, I started adding codes to the transcripts. But as I was doing that, and as I was reading the transcripts, I began to sort and sort of inductively add additional codes and subcodes. So, as I was sort of knowledge of students' understanding of data, I started to see other things pop out, other subcodes pop out among that. The pre-knowledge and experience fear of data became something that I saw a lot in terms of what teachers were talking about around students' understanding of data. And so as I came across something, I could add codes as I went. So if I wanted to add a new code, and there's my new code. I also was able to, as I was going, organize the codes into hierarchies. So as I sort of added these new codes inductively as I was going through my transcripts, I then not only went back and re-deductively coded the transcripts, but I also began to look for ways that the codes could be collapsed and expanded. So if I decided that COVID data and demo codes were sort of actually both part of this larger idea, I could add another code, that larger code, and then I could put both of these within that larger code. So it allowed me to be able to sort my codes, to combine them into these bigger ideas, or to tease them apart as I was going through this process. So, I really liked the interface of Delve because it allowed for that easy drag drop of coding and reorganizing things as I was going. I'm a fairly visual learner when I'm doing these kinds of things. And so this process, it made my thinking a lot easier as I was going through this. It was interesting. When I was talking to my dissertation advisor about this, when she was doing her dissertation, she literally printed out all of her transcripts and used highlighters of different colors to code. And that just blew my mind. So a couple of other of the features of Delve that I really liked that were really helpful to this process was that as I was coding, I could come in, if you click on codes, they're all actually here. I can go back to my actual dissertation project to show this. When you go into the codes, it gives you the numbers of how many snippets you have coded into each of those buckets. And so I used that as I was going as well to look for the relative significance of each of the codes that I was building. And if I saw some that were particularly low, that led me to think about, okay, maybe is this either not a real code, or can it be combined with something else in order to make it more evenly balanced with some of these other ideas? Or if I saw one that had a lot of snippets in it, thinking about, okay, maybe this is actually more than one idea. And you can also export this, which is great. You can export the codes as a CSV, and it puts them out for you as a list of the code names, the hierarchy, the number of codes, and the code descriptor if you've included that. So that was sort of the process that I went through with Delve. I'm happy to answer more questions about Delve and the tool itself, and also some of the features of it that I didn't use, such as the collaborative feature, which is great. But because this is my dissertation project, I was working on this all on my own for this one. But I'm going to go back now to sort of talking about my project and the findings, and I can come back to Delve afterwards. So the findings from my project. I'm going to present just a very small selection of findings for each of the research questions that I asked in this dissertation, just to give you a little bit of a snippet of sort of what the findings were and what my learning was. So starting with the first question on what components of pedagogical content knowledge for data literacy were surfaced by the teachers. So of that giant list of codes that I was showing you within Delve, that collapsed basically into 17 total components of PCK. So within the larger codes of teachers' knowledge of students' understanding of data and of strategies for teaching data literacy, and then orientation to teaching data, there were 17 codes that came out of that. And these were sort of ideas that were surfaced by the teachers. So this was knowledge that the teachers had, but had never really been given the chance to talk about, to put language to. And so this process was really about teasing out and surfacing the knowledge that teachers had about how to teach data literacy and really putting it at the forefront so that they could focus on it and think about it and put language to it. So I'm going to just give you a little bit of deeper detail into a couple of these, specifically that students have a fear of numbers and that their conception of data is constrained. And those are kind of very closely linked. And then the third, making data tangible, is an example of a component of knowledge for teaching with and about data that supports the conceptions about students having a fear of numbers and a constrained idea of data. So students' conception of data is constrained. The fact that students have a fear of numbers has been widely documented. It's especially in mathematics education, like this is a real thing. It's a real issue. It's a pipeline issue for STEM. And the teachers in this study all supported that finding, with multiple teachers discussing how their students' math comfort was low, how their students felt stupid around numbers. and that was a real sort of barrier for engaging with data and data literacy in the classroom. However, what makes this knowledge about students' understanding especially important to data literacy is that students also have a tendency to think of data as being just numbers. So here's a quote from one of my teachers that shows, when students aren't comfortable with numbers and they think data is just numbers, they will find data to be alienating. So this was a topic that the teachers talked about a lot in terms of thinking about how to teach data literacy, is trying to expand students' vision of data as being not just numbers, but qualitative data as well, things that are related to their own lives. And that was another thing that came up, was that the teachers discussed the fact that students often don't see or acknowledge the data that affects their daily lives. They don't realize that that everything that they're interacting with in the world has a data component to it. So this is a really important component of pedagogical content knowledge for data literacy. And it shows teachers holding knowledge about how students conceptualize data, and basically why those student conceptions can create barriers to learning. And so when teachers forefront this and think about it, it can allow them to think about ways to overcome those barriers. So the teachers in the study also discussed ways to overcome those barriers, one of which was by making data tangible. So here are a couple of examples of instructional strategies that teachers discussed, including using white felt to measure soot in the air as something tangible that students could see. That's not quantitative, obviously, but they can compare like the different levels of darkness that the felt becomes when placed in different places, and it makes data just more tangible for them. Another suggestion was using a collection of pennies to introduce data visualization and complexity, and sort of looking at the pennies that don't fit. And so these strategies represent specific examples of another component of PCK for data literacy, which is the knowledge that even at the high school level, students need to connect with data kinesthetically to grow their conception of what data is and overcome their association with and fear of numbers. So this is, these findings basically echo some previous research on how middle school students conceive of data. Gebre highlighted how most studies on data literacy focus on procedural competencies, and that few studies examine how students conceptualize data and its role in their lives. And so Gebre's work, combined with findings from my study, suggests that there is a need for more research in this area, especially in partnership with teachers who already hold a lot of this knowledge, but might not have the language or the time to properly reflect on and codify it. So this is sort of a really important thing that I'm thinking about in my research going forward, is basically how we can tap into this knowledge that teachers have, especially experienced teachers, and give them space to sort of forefront that knowledge and those ideas to allow for a greater focus on explicitly teaching data literacy in classrooms. All right, so the second research question asked about how teachers' knowledge, both their subject matter knowledge of data literacy and their pedagogical content knowledge, changed over the course of the workshop series. And while in my dissertation, as I said, I built cases for each teacher and I delved into each teacher individually. I'm going to just give you one quick finding here that was consistent across all 4 teachers, which was that all 4 teachers, as a result of this workshop, planned and are now in their next year of teaching and are increasing the use of Google Sheets as a tool for data literacy in their classrooms. All 4 of the teachers spoke extensively about their plans to incorporate Google Sheets into their classroom going forward, and their increased belief that it's a necessary tool for students to learn. I was, of course, overjoyed by that. I think there are a lot of data analysis tools out there, but Google Sheets is one that is particularly accessible to high school students because it is web-based, it's completely free, it's collaborative, so there are a lot of really great things about it. So that was an exciting outcome. And then my final question asked about the components of the PD that supported teachers developing their own knowledge. And so there were a lot of different components of things that I used in the workshop to sort of support the surfacing of their knowledge and providing language for them to discuss and reflect. But the most important component ended up just being the building a community of support. So this was summed up really nicely by one of my teachers when she said in her post-interview that people and time is so valuable. Having that time to connect with other teachers, really making the time and space where we are talking to each other, that was the gift that you gave us. So the teachers viewed this workshop as a gift of time and space to support each other and learn from each other. And as a researcher, a teacher educator and a former classroom teacher, I am just very glad that my dissertation research was able to provide this for them and help them grow a supportive community. And just putting my practitioner hat on, that outcome made this study a success and basically created the inspiration and motivation that got me through the defense and the final write-up of my dissertation. So, I'm happy that I was able to give that to the teachers. And then finally, just some implications from this research. The primary hypothesis for my dissertation study was that there is such a thing as PCK for data literacy, that it is unique from PCK for science more generally. And the findings from my study support that hypothesis. So the implications for practice and research are primarily to continue to support teachers in highlighting that knowledge and to conduct more research into PCK for data literacy, which is something that I'm currently pursuing as part of my career. And basically solidify the learning goals for data literacy in K through 12 classrooms, especially in collaborations with teachers who already hold a lot of that knowledge. So this is just a sort of snippet of my research that I'm doing currently, and hoping that it was interesting. And I am now happy to answer any questions.
Hi, thank you so much, Kate. That was a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed the way that you took us on a journey, not only of the tool, which we're all really interested in hearing about, but also of what you learned as a result of the study. And for me personally, just as what you said at the end, that's also personally really relevant. As a teacher myself, some of those findings really resonated with me. So thanks for sharing that as well. We have a question from a participant, and then Christina and I also have compiled a few questions. So thanks so much for leaving the time for us to discuss those. Anne wanted to ask, so first of all, she made a comment. She said she loves the simplicity of the coding system that you showed. She has one small question. Is it possible for the higher order codes to retrieve the snippets from all the subcodes that sit underneath them?
I am going to actually pass that off to Alex, who is one of the developers of Delve.
Yeah, happy to answer that.
Yeah.
And first, thanks so much, Kate. It was all great. The quick answer is yes. It defaults to just showing, you might notice the numbers here aren't necessarily adding up. Like the numbers you're seeing on this screen is showing that like learning outcomes itself is 20 codes, but you can use the snippets tab to actually do a number of different combinations. But one of them is to basically say, give me a parent code with all its children. And if you, you have to switch to filter snippets by, I actually think it's correctly. Yeah, I think that's basically what Kate just did. Should do it. Actually, could you do any? If you go to the all button, it if you click that, yeah, and then this. So yeah, so basically it's saying that 55 snippets are coded by this parent and all its children. So that's how you do it.
Beautiful, great, thank you so much. That's really helpful. So the answer is yes, we can retrieve all of the snippets at a top higher order code in the way that that Kate's just shown. Thank you. Alex, you had a question around the project itself to Kate. So when you were analyzing the teachers' as cases individually and then combined them in Delve. How did you do that? And kind of as an extension, was it all part of one project, or was it separate projects per teacher?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was separate projects. So it was sort of an iterative process. So I started with everything in the larger dissertation project. And then because of that copy code function, I then, like, once I had sort of built up my coding scheme within the larger dissertation project, I did break it out into each teacher individually and look at them separately that way, having copied the codes from that I developed when I was kind of looking at all of them to tease out those codes. And then I broke it up into separate projects for each teacher and coded them in order to build my cases that way. So it was a little bit backwards from the typical process of like building cases and then looking for themes, because I did sort of look for the larger themes first and then apply those themes to the individual cases, but it was iterative. So the themes that were applied to the individual cases, then I did develop some additional stuff as I was looking at the cases, but then went back into the larger analysis. So as research tends to be, it wasn't quite perfectly cut and dry. But yeah, so I did create separate projects for each of the teachers. I hope that answers your question.
Excellent. So just to ensure that I understand that both the question and the answer correctly, that's the way that you integrated the multiple types of materials from a single unit of analysis, as it were.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Brilliant. Thank you so much. I had a question around that as well. So you've answered both of ours there. Thank you. Christina had a question. So she's saying that we're always interested in how tools help us and facilitate our processes, and whether and how the use of tools sometimes changes the way that we work, or can change the way that we work, and how it could sometimes offer the possibilities that maybe aren't possible using pen and paper. So she's just interested in your experience and what the things were that you did with your data that you maybe wouldn't have been able to do if you hadn't used Delve.
That is a great question, Christina. I am young enough that I didn't ever really do qualitative coding with pen and paper. I've always used computer supported tools to do my qualitative coding. But before I started using Delve, I was doing a lot of this just in Excel, where basically like we would take transcripts and we would put transcripts into Excel and then try and code the snippets that way. And Delve it allowed for a lot smoother flow of thought for me, because it, as I was reading the transcripts, it was almost like I was like writing memos, like with the codes, right? It's like each time I came across something that jumped out at me, I was like, oh, like, let me just add a new code that, references that. And then that code would sometimes become something that stayed because it was something that turned up a lot more, or it was something that like didn't. And so then I had to kind of come back to it and figure out, does it fit in somewhere else? But it was almost like I was annotating the transcripts as I went. And so for me, that just allowed for a really nice flow of thought in terms of pulling out the themes in a way that, I wasn't able to do as well when I was working with a tool that wasn't as dynamic, basically. And I really appreciated the drag and drop too. I think that just in terms of how my brain works, it allowed me to visually organize my codes as I went in a way that was dynamic. And so being able to like move them around into hierarchies, and really like build my gestalt of my codes and my coding manual as I went. So I think that the hierarchy piece definitely changed the way that I thought about the codes and allowed for a lot more easy like combination of codes and teasing apart of codes than I think I had done previously when doing it in like you know, an Excel space. So I don't know if that answers the question, but.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. A few things strike me from that. Thank you, Kate. So one of them is it like the use of codes as like signposts almost for things to follow up, and then some of those get dropped and some of them get the full status of a code, as it were. That's a really nice way of putting it. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you. So you were talking about your constant comparative method and how you were cycling between inductive and deductive working as you went along, and coding and analyzing kind of simultaneously. And I know that when I have done that sort of work, I have sometimes found it really quite tricky to keep track of when I'm doing what. So when I'm working deductively, when I'm working inductively, and kind of to keep almost like, I suppose, for any research project, the sort of transparency of the process in some senses, and to keep tabs on that. And I was wondering how you personally kept track of that, and whether Delve could help you to track that sort of process.
So personally for me, because I didn't have a lot of transcripts, right? I had 14, 15 of them. 14, I think. The 9 workshops, the 4 interviews, plus the one that contained all of the written reflections. I just sort of went through it as a process where, like, I went through all 9 workshops, sort of adding codes as I went. And then I went through them again, you know, to read through them and see if anything else like jumped into adding the codes, you know, and then I went through them. So it was, for me, it was really just like, I went through them all and then I went, you know, so like each step in the process was like deductively coding into the codes that had been created in the previous process, or like in the previous iteration through them. And so I think that was my method, just simply because I didn't have a lot of transcripts. And so it was relatively easy for me to keep track of where I was in terms of my cycle through them. But yeah, I don't know if Alex has any thoughts on like how Delve could support that process, either in its current iteration or going forward.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, we've often seen people usually like sort of deductively code and then sort of often inductively code within those deductive codes. And in that case, it's very much that the deductive codes become the higher level codes, and that's sort of how the organization happens. I think what Kate's describing was like maybe a slightly different approach, but usually, yeah, we see a lot of use of the hierarchies as a means of doing that. And then barring that, we've also just seen people have like a naming convention to sort of say like, this is, you know, one of my original deductive codes and here are my new inductive codes. And so that's the other method we've seen people use, but there's probably some other methods too that you could use with the system, I would say.
Brilliant. Thank you. Those are great tips. I think very relevant to lots of people and going forward with their work as well. So thank you. We've got 2 other questions from participants. So Joseph says, how did you handle cross-cutting and overlapping themes in your work?
Yeah, thanks. That's great, Joseph. I think for me, that was really about the like drag and drop and like the hierarchy of the codes. So, you know, as I was inductively coding, one example is that like I noticed that there were a lot of places where teachers were talking about, like I had a separate code for like data tools are powerful and another code for something else about data tools. And so basically through that process, I collapsed those codes and I turned it into like, I forget exactly what the wording was, but like that was, I think the way that I handled that, because I was really, this was a very, new topic. Like I really was building the knowledge and the classification of this as I went. It was not like pedagogical content knowledge for data literacy was not something that had existing categorization or existing components. I really was sort of trying to tease those components out as I went. And there were definitely some through lines in terms of larger themes that went through the components. So actually, here, let me just, nope, other way, stop. So this, if I can get back to it, my lovely map of all, here we go. So within this, so these are the sort of 17 different components. But as I was writing my dissertation and in papers that I'm creating from this, like there are some real, as you were saying, cross-cutting themes. And I think that comes out in the write-up and the analysis of these components. So looking at like data has the power to manipulate versus, like students make and use assumptions, right? Like there are definitely these ideas that run across these components. And that doesn't so much come out in the actual coding, but comes out in the analysis and the write-up. So as I showed actually in my presentation, right, like the connection between like these two components, students have a fear of numbers and students' conception of data is constrained, and how those are supported by this idea of making data tangible. And again, it's like learning to tell a compelling story using data is one of the goals that teachers said for data literacy. And then, right, using storytelling to build inferences was actually one of the tools that they use, one of the strategies, right? So there are definitely these larger cross-cutting themes. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, Joseph, but I think that came out less in my coding and more in my write-up and analysis.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so the connection between those themes, which may originally come out through the intersection of codes, but over time are also coming out in the interpretation of the materials.
Yes.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
No, that's fine.
Clarifying my convoluted explanation.
It was very clear. It was very clear. So one final question from Christopher. So Christopher, thanks you for your presentation. I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little on how you arrived at the sample, and Christopher's particularly interested in whether kind of data saturation was something that you were taking into consideration in this particular study.
Yeah, so this was definitely a small exploratory study. So I only worked with 4 teachers, and the sample of teachers just came, it was mostly a convenient sample. They were teachers that had taken the summer PD who were all planning to implement in the fall. So they were on a similar implementation schedule. They were from kind of a cross section of schools from the Philadelphia School District. So that sample size was very much a small convenient sample. And then in terms of the coding, because it was a small sample size and because I didn't have a ton of data, I had these 14 transcripts, about 20 hours total of time plus certain answers. My sort of saturation was just literally I coded everything because I could, because it wasn't a lot. I know generally with the constant comparative method, oftentimes when people hit what they call a saturation point, they then stop going back and deductively coding previous transcripts. But because I had a very sort of manageable amount of data, I was able to basically go through them enough times that I felt like everything had been coded. So that was sort of how I hit my saturation point for this research. It was also because it was my dissertation. It was I think, there was some extra pressure on really making sure that I had thoroughly dug into my data. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. If not, please clarify. But hopefully that is some more information for you.
Perfect. Thank you for that insight into the process. It's always just so useful to hear how others are actually engaging in their work and kind of open that black box of analysis and process, which is one of the reasons why we love running these webinars so much. So thank you so much, Kate, for your time with us today. On behalf of everyone here, thanks for sharing that with us and giving us an opportunity to spend a bit of time thinking also about our own practice in relation to that. Yeah, thank you everybody for joining us today. And we are just delighted to have had Kate here. Thank you also to Alex for being present. The recording of the webinar will be sent around, and you can see the recordings of our previously held webinars at a link I shared at the beginning, which I can share again. And yeah, do feel free to spread the word, invite others around to the next iterations of these, and hope to see you again soon. Thanks again, Kate.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you, everyone, for coming.